How do you take a country where tens of millions of people just starve to death and turn it into the second largest economy on the planet in less than 4 decades? That is not a rhetorical question. That actually happened. And the answer involves a secret experiment by desperate farmers, a leader who was willing to abandon ideology for results, and a series of decisions so radical that the people making them could have been executed for doing so. This is the story of how China went from mass starvation to superpower, and it is one of the most extraordinary transformations in all of human history. Let me paint you a picture of where China was in 1978. The average Chinese citizen was earning the equivalent of about $150 per year. Roughly 800 million people were living in poverty. Food was rationed. Meat was a luxury most families could only dream about. The country had just emerged from the Cultural Revolution, a decade of ideological madness that destroyed schools, persecuted intellectuals, and dismantled the very institutions China needed to function. Mao Zedong had died just 2 years earlier, leaving behind a nation that was, by almost every measurable standard, an economic catastrophe. And here's the part that most people in the West do not fully appreciate. This was not ancient history. People who are in their 60s today were alive for this. The transformation we are about to talk about happened within a single human lifetime. Parents who grew up watching neighbors die of hunger raised children who became billionaires. That scale of change, that speed of change, is almost impossible to wrap your head around. But we are going to try. Because understanding how China did this is not just historically interesting. It tells us something profound about what is actually possible when the right conditions align, when the right decisions get made, and when human potential is finally allowed to breathe. So let us go back to where it all really started. Not in Beijing, not in any government office. It started in a tiny village called Xiaogang in the Anhui province in the winter of 1978. Anhui was one of the poorest regions in an already desperately poor country. The people there were farming under the collective system, which meant all land belonged to the state. Everyone worked together and everyone received the same share of whatever was produced, regardless of how hard they worked. In theory, it sounded fair. In practice, it was a disaster. When your reward is identical whether you work hard or barely try, most rational people eventually stop working hard. Production collapsed. And in Anhui, people were not just poor, they were starving. Farmers were begging in neighboring provinces. Children were dying. And 18 farmers in Xiaogang, sitting in a house one desperate night, made a decision that was technically illegal and potentially punishable by death. They agreed to divide the communal land into private plots, one for each family. Each family would farm their own land, meet a quota for the government, and then keep everything they produced beyond that quota for themselves. They signed a secret document. They agreed that if any of them were arrested or executed, the others would raise their children. That is how serious they knew this was. They hid what they were doing. And then something remarkable happened. That first harvest, their output absolutely exploded. Families that had barely been producing enough to survive suddenly had surpluses. They had food. They had more than food. Word spread. Other villages started doing the same thing quietly. A few local officials looked the other way because they could see it was working. And here is where leadership becomes critical to this story. Deng Xiaoping, who had emerged as China's paramount leader in 1978 after his own extraordinary political journey, of being purged twice during the Mao era, heard about what was happening in Anhui. He could have cracked down. That would have been the ideologically pure thing to do. Instead, he sent investigators. They confirmed that agricultural output had skyrocketed in the villages that had adopted private farming. Deng's response was essentially, if it works, let it work. He famously expressed the idea that it does not matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. This philosophical pivot, choosing results over ideology, became the engine of everything that followed. In 1980, the household responsibility system was officially rolled out across China. Farmers got to keep the fruits of their labor above the state quota. Agricultural production surged. By 1984, grain output had reached a record high. The rural famine crisis was broken. Hundreds of millions of people had more food than they had ever had in their lives. This was not a minor policy tweak. This was a fundamental restructuring of economic incentives, and it worked with breathtaking speed. But here is what I want you to understand about Deng's genius. He did not stop there. He was not satisfied with solving the food problem. He was looking at countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and seeing something China did not have. Manufacturing, industry, export capacity, global economic integration. He was looking at the wealth being generated in capitalist economies, and he was asking a question that was almost heretical in communist China at the time. Why can we not have some of that? In 1980, Deng did something that would have seemed completely insane from the vantage point of just a few years earlier. He designated 4 special economic zones in southern China. Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. These were areas where foreign investment would be welcomed, where market-based pricing could operate, where factories could be built by foreign companies using Chinese labor, where capitalism, in a controlled, geographically limited form, would be permitted to function. Shenzhen is the story that captures your imagination. In 1980, Shenzhen was a small fishing village with a population of around 30,000 people. Today, it is a city of over 13 million. It is one of the busiest ports on Earth. It is home to companies like Huawei and Tencent. It went from fishing village to tech metropolis in the span of a generation. And it happened because Deng drew a line on a map next to Hong Kong and said, "Here, we will try something different." The results in the special economic zones were undeniable. Foreign investment poured in. Factories were built. Jobs were created. Infrastructure went up almost overnight. Wages in these zones, while still low by global standards, were dramatically higher than rural farming incomes. People began migrating from the countryside to these coastal cities in massive numbers. And as the zones succeeded, Deng expanded the experiment. More cities were opened. More regions were allowed to participate in the market economy. By the mid-1980s, China was undergoing a dual transformation. The rural sector had been liberated by private farming. The urban sector was being energized by industrial development and foreign investment. But the reform process was not smooth. It was messy and at times violent. Inflation surged. Corruption exploded as people in positions of power used the transition from state control to personal enrichment in ways that were often brutal and unjust. Economic inequality, which had been relatively low under Mao simply because almost everyone was equally poor, began to grow sharply. And that tension between the promise of economic freedom and the reality of political repression exploded in 1989. Tiananmen Square. Students and workers and intellectuals gathering in Beijing to demand political reform to match the economic opening. The government's response was a massacre. The death toll remains uncertain to this day. The crackdown shocked the world. Western governments imposed sanctions. Many economists and analysts predicted that China's economic rise was over, that the international community would not continue to invest in and trade with a government that had just killed its own citizens. They were wrong. And the reason they were wrong tells us something uncomfortable but important about how global economics actually functions. The economic incentives of trading with China, of manufacturing in China, of accessing the Chinese market, proved stronger than the moral outrage. Western sanctions were gradually lifted, businesses returned, and Deng, who had authorized the crackdown, pivoted back to economic reform with remarkable speed. In 1992, an elderly Deng Xiaoping, by then in his late 80s, made what became known as his Southern Tour. He traveled to the special economic zones, to Shenzhen and other rapidly developing areas, and he made a series of speeches that essentially relaunched the reform era. He pushed back against conservatives within the Communist Party who wanted to slow or reverse the market openings, and he declared that development was the only hard truth. More cities were opened, more sectors were liberalized, more foreign investment was welcomed. This was a pivotal moment, because by the early 1990s there were real questions about whether China would continue reforming or would retreat into a more closed, Soviet-style economic model. Deng's Southern Tour answered that question decisively. China was going to keep reforming, keep opening, keep growing. And the 1990s were a decade of extraordinary expansion as a result. But perhaps the single biggest accelerant to China's rise was still to come. In 2001, after years of negotiations, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a transformational event. Membership in the WTO meant that other countries had to lower their trade barriers to Chinese goods. It meant that Chinese factories, already producing at massive scale with relatively low labor costs, now had guaranteed access to markets around the world. The flood of Chinese manufacturing that followed reshaped the global economy in ways that we are still living with today. Prices of consumer goods in America and Europe dropped dramatically. Factories in the US Midwest, in the industrial towns of England and Germany, could not compete with Chinese manufacturing costs and began to close. This was devastating for millions of workers in developed countries. But for China, it was rocket fuel. Exports exploded. Foreign exchange reserves accumulated. Cities grew. Infrastructure was built on a scale never before seen. Think about the numbers for a moment because they are genuinely staggering. In 1990, China's GDP was roughly $360 billion. By 2000, it was about $1.2 trillion. By 2010, it had crossed $6 trillion. By 2020, it was approaching $15 trillion. That trajectory, that compounding growth sustained over multiple decades, represents something that has never happened before in economic history. No country of that size has ever grown that fast for that long, and the poverty reduction numbers are even more stunning. The World Bank estimates that China is responsible for the majority of all global poverty reduction since 1990. Think about what that means. When global poverty statistics have improved over the past 30 years, most of that improvement happened in China. Hundreds of millions of people moved from genuine deprivation, from not having enough to eat, to the middle class. And while that middle class, by Western standards, might still have appeared modest, the change in lived experience was enormous. People who grew up in one-room farmhouses with dirt floors moved into apartments in cities with running water and electricity. Their children went to schools that actually functioned. They bought motorcycles, then cars. They got smartphones. They traveled. This was not just economic data on a chart. This was human life changing on an unprecedented scale. So how did China do it? What were the actual mechanics? Because just saying Deng reformed things is not enough of an answer. Let me break down the core elements. First, agricultural liberation. As we discussed, giving farmers control over their own output transformed rural productivity overnight. This was the foundation. You cannot build an industrial economy on a population that is starving. Second, gradualism and experimentation. Unlike the Soviet Union, which attempted a rapid shock therapy transition to capitalism in the early 1990s and descended into chaos and oligarchy, China moved incrementally. Try something in a special economic zone. If it works, expand it. If it does not, contain the damage. This experimental approach allowed for learning and adjustment in real time. It was messy and imperfect, but it prevented the catastrophic collapses that derailed other transition economies. Third, massive investment in infrastructure. China built roads, ports, railways, airports, power plants, and telecommunications networks at a pace and scale that was simply staggering. By the time factories were ready to produce, there were ways to get goods to markets. By the time cities were growing, there were ways to connect them. This infrastructure investment, much of it funded by the state, created the physical foundation on which private and foreign enterprise could operate. Fourth, education and human capital. China had always placed enormous cultural value on education, but post-reform, actual investment in schools and universities dramatically increased. The number of college graduates entering the workforce multiplied. China began producing engineers and scientists in enormous quantities. This allowed Chinese manufacturing to gradually move up the value chain from simple assembly work to more sophisticated production. 2, eventually, original innovation. Fifth, integration with global supply chains. Chinese policymakers were strategic about how they connected with the global economy. They did not just open their doors and hope for the best. They actively courted foreign companies, offered favorable terms for setting up manufacturing, required technology transfers in many cases, and used those relationships to learn and develop their own capabilities. Critics, particularly in the United States, have argued that some of these practices amounted to forced technology theft. That debate is ongoing and legitimate, but what is undeniable is that the strategy worked in terms of accelerating Chinese industrial capability. Sixth, the role of the Chinese diaspora. Often overlooked in Western accounts of China's rise is the enormous contribution of overseas Chinese communities. Particularly in the early reform years, much of the foreign investment flowing into China, especially into Guangdong and Fujian provinces, came not from Western multinationals, but from ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and Southeast Asia. They spoke the language, they had the cultural connections. They understood both the business environment and the opportunity. They were willing to move fast. Their capital and expertise were crucial in the early stages. Seventh, political stability and long-term planning. This one is complicated because political stability in China's case came with authoritarian repression. But from a pure economic development standpoint, the ability of the Chinese government to make long-term infrastructure commitments and stick to them, to implement policy decisions quickly and at scale, to maintain a stable macroeconomic environment over decades, gave investors and manufacturers the predictability they needed. Democratic governments often struggle with long-term planning because electoral cycles create short-term pressures. China did not have that constraint. Now, I want to be honest with you about the costs of this transformation because they were real and they were enormous. The environmental destruction wrought by 40 years of breakneck industrial development has been catastrophic. China now has some of the most polluted air, water, and soil on the planet. Cities became essentially unbreathable for extended periods. Rivers were poisoned. The health consequences for hundreds of millions of people have been severe. The human rights situation never improved to match the economic opening. The Communist Party maintained its monopoly on political power throughout. Dissent was crushed. Ethnic minorities, particularly in Tibet and Xinjiang, faced severe repression. The labor rights of the factory workers who built China's manufacturing miracle were routinely violated. Working conditions in many facilities, particularly in the early years, were brutal. The housing demolitions that accompanied rapid urbanization displaced tens of millions of people, often with minimal compensation and no legal recourse, and inequality soared. The Gini coefficient, which measures economic inequality, rose dramatically from the relatively flat distribution of the Maoist era. China went from being a highly equal society, equally poor, to a highly unequal one. billionaires emerged, a massive wealthy urban class developed, and at the same time, hundreds of millions of rural residents were left behind, or only partially brought along. The gap between coastal cities and interior rural areas became one of the defining social tensions of modern China. None of this cancels out the genuine human gains of the transformation. Fewer people starving is obviously better than more people starving. But it is important to hold both realities at the same time. The miracle had a price. It is also worth asking a question that does not get asked enough in the West. How replicable is what China did? Can other developing countries follow the same path? The answer is probably, partially, but not fully. Some elements of China's success were unique to China's specific circumstances. China had an enormous population, which meant enormous labor supply and enormous domestic market potential. It had a Confucian cultural tradition that, whatever its other characteristics, placed high value on education, discipline, and collective effort. It had a relatively strong state capacity, even coming out of the Mao era. It had the timing advantage of entering global markets just as technology was enabling truly global supply chains for the first time. And it had the geographic luck of a long coastline that made export-oriented manufacturing viable. Other developing countries faced different constraints. Many lack the state capacity to coordinate the kind of infrastructure investment China managed. Many are smaller and lack the domestic market scale. Many face governance challenges that make sustained policy implementation over decades nearly impossible. The lesson is not that any country can do what China did. The lesson is more nuanced. It is about the power of incentive alignment, of connecting effort to reward, of opening to the world while protecting the ability to learn and develop, of long-term planning at scale. Now let us talk about where China is today in 2026 and the challenges it faces, because the story is not over. In many ways, the next chapter is even more consequential than what came before. China has reached what economists call the middle-income trap threshold, or in some measures, has already crossed into upper middle-income territory. The low-cost labor advantage that drove the first phase of development is diminishing. Chinese wages have risen significantly, meaning that some of the most basic manufacturing has already shifted to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and other lower-cost countries. China needs to move up the value chain further, from assembly to innovation, from manufacturing to technology development, from imitation to original creation. It is making that transition with considerable success in some areas. Chinese companies are now world leaders in electric vehicles, renewable energy technology, artificial intelligence research, and telecommunications infrastructure. Huawei, despite the attempts by the United States to contain it, remains one of the world's leading telecommunications companies. BYD has become a dominant global force in electric vehicles. TikTok's parent company ByteDance built one of the most powerful content algorithms ever created. But China also faces serious structural challenges. The population is aging rapidly. Decades of the one-child policy have created a demographic cliff that will see the working-age population shrink over the coming decades. A shrinking workforce supporting a growing elderly population creates enormous fiscal pressure. The real estate sector, which became enormously oversized and is now going through a painful correction, has wiped out significant wealth and created significant economic instability. The relationship with the United States and its allies has become increasingly adversarial, with technology restrictions, tariffs, and geopolitical tensions creating real headwinds. And the political trajectory under Xi Jinping has moved in a more repressive direction. Xi consolidated power to an unprecedented degree, eliminating term limits, purging rivals, and centralizing decision-making in ways that some economists argue are recreating earlier problems. When too much power concentrates in too few hands, bad decisions do not get checked. The space for the kind of experimental bottom-up innovation that characterized the Xiaogang farmers has narrowed. There is a deep irony here. The very success of the Communist Party in delivering economic development gave it legitimacy to consolidate political control, and that consolidation may now be creating conditions that make continued economic development harder. But let us not end on a note of inevitability about any particular outcome. China's trajectory over the next 20 years is genuinely uncertain. History does not move in straight lines. The country that went from famine to superpower in 40 years has demonstrated a capacity for surprising everyone. What we can say is that the choices made by a handful of desperate farmers in a small village in Anhui province, and the choices made by a pragmatic and courageous leader who decided that results mattered more than ideological purity, set in motion a chain of events that changed the lives of over 1 billion people and reshaped the global economy for generations. That is worth understanding. Not to celebrate every aspect of how it happened, not to ignore the costs and the cruelties along the way, but because understanding it honestly in its full complexity is the only way to actually learn from it. Here is what I think the deepest lesson of China's transformation is. It is not about any specific policy. It is not about authoritarianism versus democracy or capitalism versus socialism. The deepest lesson is about what happens when you take a billion human beings who want to improve their lives, and you get out of their way, when you align incentives so that working hard and creating value actually gets rewarded, when you connect people to markets so that their effort translates into outcomes, when you invest in the infrastructure and education that allows human capability to actually deploy. Human beings are extraordinarily capable. When the systems around them harness that capability rather than suppress it, the results can be breathtaking. China proved that on a scale never seen before. And whether you admire the Chinese government or despise it, whether you see China as a partner or a threat, understanding what actually happened over these 40 years is essential for understanding the world we are all living in right now. If you found this video interesting, I want you to consider something. The transformation we just talked about is one of many inflection points in history where decisions made by relatively small numbers of people changed trajectories. The farmers in Xiaogang were 18 people, 18. And their secret agreement on one cold night in 1978 contributed to lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. That should tell you something about the potential impact of getting the fundamentals right, about incentives, about trust, and about what people can accomplish when they are given the chance. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the stories behind why the world is the way it is. There's a lot more to dig into. And drop a comment below telling me which aspect of this story surprised you the most. Because based on the conversations we have had on this channel, I think there are a few things in this video that are going to genuinely change how some of you see China and the global economy more broadly.